Well, hello everyone. My name is Matt Anderson, Curator of Transportation at the Henry Ford, and it is my distinct pleasure to be joined by my colleague, Wing Fong.
Hello, everybody.
And we are going to take you on a tour through the Henry Ford's new racing exhibit, Driven to Win, Racing in America. And I'm going to get my screen shared here. There, hopefully everyone can see that all right. But boy, Wing, this exhibit has been a long time in planning and a little longer than we originally anticipated. We had planned initially to open on May 29th, but of course COVID-19 changed some of those plans for us, but exciting to be getting closer now.
It sure is.
So we'll just start by telling you a little bit about the exhibit and the background. Now, for those of you who are familiar with it, it'll be located in the back portion of our Driving America exhibit, our main automotive exhibit at Henry Ford Museum of American Innovation. You're looking here at a map of the museum, and that red circle indicates where the exhibit will be. The new exhibit's roughly 24,000 square feet in size and takes up, maybe a third of the space we have for our automotive collection. So it is a sizable footprint. Wing, I think you said it's something like 1/16 of the entire museum floor size.
Yeah, it's just about 1/16. It's one of the larger permanent exhibits that we're going to have in the space.
And I think what will really make this exhibit special is that it's one of the few, if not the only, to really focus on all the major forms of auto racing that are popular here in the United States. You know, you can go to museums that are all about stock car racing or all about IndyCar racing and so forth, but we've got a nice mix of a little bit of everything, and really important cars and stories from each of those forms of racing too. So we do go fairly deep into the evolution of auto racing here in the United States.
Yeah, Matt, I'd like to just add too that I think one of the other things that we really strive to do, and that maybe sets us apart, is we go beyond, the vehicles themselves, but really into the people behind the vehicles, both from like who drove them, but the whole team behind their creation, the designers, the engineers, and really what those vehicles, how they changed the world of racing beyond just their records, what they achieved in their races.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. That the drivers and the cars get a lot of the glory, but racing is absolutely a team sport. It's not only the team there on the track on race day, but there's the team that's back in the shop, where the team is doing the engineering side of things, the marketing team for that matter. So lots of people, and you're right, a lot of those stories in the exhibit. And what we see here is some artwork that represents what the entrance to the exhibit will look like. Here's some concept art. And as you walk in, you'll notice the sign there, Driven to Win, and you're facing the back of the museum. Behind you would be our current drive-in theater, if you can picture that space. So sort of in what we call the car court. And you notice the sign up there, and we're proud to say that the exhibit is presented by General Motors. They are our lead sponsor and have been a tremendous friend throughout the development and design of this exhibit. And the first thing you'll notice is that archway that kind of leads into the entrance. And that arch is something of an homage to the bridges that you cross to get to the infield on a track circuit. And there's actually going to be some motion. We have some images, some video that will be projected on there to give some life to the exhibit. And the first thing you'll see, and you'll forgive me, I'll just read this, I think it's worth doing, is sort of the main paragraph or the main idea behind our exhibit. Driven to Win, Racing in America. American racing reflects the very character of the American people. Its diverse forms and settings appeal to our independent spirit. Its sights and sounds satisfy our love of spectacle, and its dangers affirm our identity as a nation of risk takers, forever pushing the limits. From hot rodders in Southern California to bootleggers in North Carolina, American racing is shaped by athletes, innovators, and entrepreneurs who are inspired by challenge and driven to win. So I think that nicely sums up those stories that we're going to get to through this exhibition. And here's just a map, a layout of what the exhibit will look like with the various zones, and the arrows show you the route we're going to follow as we walk through each of those zones one by one today. So just to give you some further orientation about where we're headed. And we start where else but at the very beginning with a section we're calling the Dawn of Racing. And there's an old joke that when was the first car race? Well, as soon as they built the second car, right? There's just this inherent need or desire in people to race, to compete. But there is, in fact, a more legitimate answer, if you will, to that question. In the United States, it's generally traced back to November of 1895, when Chicago Times-Herald sponsored a race between Chicago and Evanston, Illinois, with a number of cars there that competed in. Very difficult race. It snowed that day, very cold. The roads were muddy and difficult, but won by the Duryea brothers. And we have an early example of a Duryea automobile in the collection. But the first two race cars we'll be looking at, you see here in this photograph, we have Henry Ford's 1901 Sweepstakes, the car that really launched him on his journey, which would lead to Ford Motor Company, the Model T, and everything that came after that. Beneath that, you see Old 16. That was the first American-built car to win the Vanderbilt Cup, which was the first major international road race held in the United States. And the Old 16 was a locomobile, so built in Connecticut, but indeed American-made. And this will give you a sense of how each of these zones is set up. We typically look at a signature race or event. In this case, it is that Vanderbilt Cup race. And we profile significant people, whether they be drivers or entrepreneurs or race team owners, folks behind the scenes. And in this area, we're focusing on two of the biggest names, still very famous names even outside of racing, Henry Ford and then Louis Chevrolet, who himself was a racing driver who was involved in the formation of the Chevrolet that is still around with us today. And more concept art here to give you an idea of what that area will look like as you walk in. The first car you will see is Sweepstakes, which I think is appropriate. I mentioned how Sweepstakes is what launched Henry Ford onto his journey. And I think it's fair to say that without Sweepstakes, there would be no Ford Motor Company. And for that matter, no Henry Ford Museum of American Innovation. So certainly have to pay tribute to that. But you'll see the Sweepstakes in front. We're doing an environmental setting. So the turf, if you will, underneath it will have the feel of a dirt track. Old 16 will be behind it there. And we wanted to create the feel without having a photograph there, certainly not a color photograph, showing what the track looked like when Henry Ford made his race against Alexander Whitten in October of 1901. Instead, we commissioned an area artist to produce a backdrop for us. And this, I think, is a nice illustration of what will be there. But it does give you a sensation of movement, momentum, and it's worth saying in that race, Henry Ford, who was a nobody at that time, virtually unknown, even within Detroit, went up against Alexander Whitten, who was by 1901 a successful automobile manufacturer and the closest thing we had to a star race car driver. And you had this classic David and Goliath situation with Ford the nobody versus the giant Whitten. And sure enough, over the course of those 10 laps, Ford, who had never driven a race before this event, not only caught up with Whitten, but actually won the race. And as I say, that sent him off to greater glory, got him a lot of headlines in the newspapers, got some investors interested in what he was doing, and launched him on his way to eventually forming Ford Motor Company.
I like that Henry Ford is literally leaving his competition in the dust here.
That's right. That's right. Can't go wrong with that metaphor. And here's an example of the automobile labels or the label panels that we'll have with each of the cars throughout the exhibit. So it's a different format from what we have in Driven to Win in terms of the graphic design, yet it has a lot of the same information we have in, excuse me, not Driven to Win, but in Driving America in our standard automobile exhibit. And we wanted to capture a sense of movement, motion, speed in the layout of these graphics. So we've done that with vintage photographs here you see on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side there, we have a advertisement actually by Locomobile promoting the success of Old 16 in the Vanderbilt Cup. So that's an old idea, the idea of racing being used to promote automobiles or saleable products. There'll be a paragraph on each label kind of explaining the car's significance, its most important moments. And then underneath that, we have our tech box, or our spec box, if you will, where we have more technical information about the car. So engine size, horsepower, maker, competition history to the extent that we know it. We also tried to include a top speed or something like a top speed for each car. In this case, it's the average speed that the Old 16 traveled during the 1908 Vanderbilt Cup race, 64.3 miles an hour. And then on the right side of that box, you'll notice there's a shape here, a rectangular box with a layout, an overhead view of the car, and then measurements, things like wheelbase, length, width, height, and weight of the car. You'll notice this notation here for 3D car model, and this is something that was very important to us to make the exhibit as accessible as possible. We know we have some visitors who have visual challenges. We wanted to let them be able to understand what these cars look like. So using 3D printing, yeah, there's that box there. We produced a model of each and every one of the race cars that will be featured in the exhibit, and you'll see some of those 3D printed models right here. And Goldenrod there, our land speed race car at the bottom. We have the Slingshot dragster up at the top, but you'll notice Sweepstakes and Old 16 are right there in the middle, in the Ford Mark IV there next to old 16. And wing, we had to make some compromises with these models. We wanted them to be detailed on one hand, so people got a sense of what these cars actually looked like, but they also had to be durable. I mean, they are designed to be touched after all.
Yeah, we worked with a great partner out of Wayne State University. He's a design instructor, and he actually 3D scanned many of these cars in the collection to create these models. Some of them, we could find sources for, but for the majority, they had to be 3D scanned and then cleaned up and prepared for the 3D printing. And like you said, we had to make some concessions on the details here and there just to make them more durable. But it's a really interesting process, and I think it's going to be a great addition to the offerings that we have within the museum for accessibility.
Yeah, I have to say I'm really excited about these and what they will offer to our visitors, but also just really happy with how they turned out. They're better in many respects than what I even expected. So
yeah,
great to have those. The next zone that you'll move through as you walk through the exhibit is what we call igniting the passion. And here we wanted to talk about young people in particular, kids 3, 4 years old. How is it that they first get exposed to and interested in auto racing? And we're going to have an interesting vehicular experience in this area. We've acquired a quarter midget car. This is one of those real race cars that young drivers, sometimes as young as 5 or 6 years old, start out with. They've got you might call lawnmower style engines in the back there, and then the driver sits in the front. You see a photo of it on the top right here, and then below that how it will sit in the exhibit. But we're going to welcome kids to climb into that car. If they want to get a picture taken in there or just sit behind the wheel, steer it, and feel like they're in a race. So I think that'll be a great experience. We're also going to talk, of course, about things like die-cast cars or Hot Wheels cars, racing video games, certainly now more important than ever. In fact, acquired some copies of some vintage racing games, thinking of Pole Position for the Atari, which was one of the first racing games I experienced, and going all the way up to the Forza games, which are so popular today. So we'll have those and some other things through some video montages. And then maybe the most interesting collection is going to be here is our collection of what we call tether cars. And you see those on the left-hand side of this illustration. And these are little gasoline-powered race cars. They're about 15 to 18 inches in length. They were extremely popular in the years surrounding World War II, from the 30s right on up into the early 50s. And they would have these little air-cooled gasoline-powered engines, and they would drive around initially on tethers hooked to a central pivot, and they would kind of race against the clock. They're sometimes called spin dizzies because of that. You get dizzy watching these things go around in circles. But in some cities, they actually built scaled down board racetracks for these cars, where there would be a little groove or a rail that they could ride along and then race 4 or 5 of them at a time around the track. And boy, these were real cars. I mean, they would go 115, 120 miles an hour, real miles an hour, not scale, so very fast. We acquired a collection of close to 120 of these cars not too many years ago from a terrific fellow named Eric Zausner. And you see here a couple of those cars. You could buy them pre-assembled. You could buy them in kits. They came at all price points. The fancier ones could be well in excess of $100, which, as you might anticipate, was quite a bit of money in the 1930s. Right down to less expensive models in the $25 to $30 range. So we're going to have a nice variety. I think close to 80 different pieces that will be in this display case here. We've also got some trophies that were won by actual Spin Dizzy champions in the day, so we'll have some of those in there. We've got one of the toolboxes that a driver would have taken to the track with all the equipment needed to repair the car and maintain it at the track. We've even recreated a section of rail track there in the middle. And this case is really going to be impressive. We got a photo of it here. We did manage to get it installed before things closed down for COVID there. But 2 of the members of our exhibit design team there, Emily Kirk with her back to the camera, and then Rob O'Leary on the far left, posed just to give you a sense of scale. But it's really going to be, I think, an attraction as people walk into the exhibit. They'll be drawn to those cars. They really do have, I think, a lot of personality. Wouldn't you agree, Wing?
I would, yeah. And it's, the case is probably the largest case we have in the museum at the moment, and so you'll get to see a lot of cars there.
Yeah, and I'll spare you the details, but we spent quite a bit of time just figuring out how to lay out these cars so the most interesting ones would be closer to viewers and make sure they would all physically fit. But it was a lot of fun, but just one of the little challenges we've dealt with in putting this exhibit together. Then once you move through from igniting the passion, you'll enter what is really the hub of the exhibit, our theater experience, where we have commissioned a new film called Fueled by Passion, which takes a look at, follows young drivers involved in various types of racing throughout the United States. And this is the poster created just for the exhibit there. And if you look at the corners, you'll see very much by design. We've got the major forms of racing represented, drag racing in the top left, top right, a couple of stock cars. Bottom right, we've got a Pikes Peak car, actually a BMW in the Pikes Peak Hill Climb. Bottom left, we have a land speed racer used out of Bonneville, sort of an homage to the classic dry lake hot rods of the 30s. And then right under the Fuel by Passion logo there in the center is an Indy car. And you could argue maybe Indy is one of the most American forms of racing, if you will, the one that pops into a lot of people's minds first. And we had access to some of the top young drivers and crew members and folks out there in racing today. Our crews followed them at various events around the country. So for IndyCar racing, we were able to connect with Joseph Newgarden from Team Penske, follow him at the 2019 Indianapolis 500. We worked with Megan Volk out at Bonneville. She's a young woman who's working to get into the 200-mile-an-hour club there, to do 200 miles an hour on the Bonneville Salt Flats. So we'll follow her there. Tim Hardy is the fellow we worked with at Pikes Peak. He's got that BMW we took a look at, so we'll follow him. And I have to say, we've of course seen the finished film and the footage, and some of the most dramatic footage is what they took at Pikes Peak. They have, of course, cameras on drones. They're following up that twisting course, and you get a real sense for just how dangerous it is on Pikes Peak. The speeds they're going, the sheer drop-offs on the side of the road, so that'll be particularly exciting, I think. Brianna Daniels, who the first African-American woman to be involved with a major NASCAR pit crew. So we follow her, and she tells us a little bit about her experiences in NASCAR. And then Brittany Force, certainly one of the biggest names in drag racing today. Not only Brittany, but also her sisters and her father, John Force, himself a drag racing legend. So we follow them in their efforts to win their in Top Fuel competition. And here's some concept art of what the inside of the theater will look like. And the screen is very purposely shaped in kind of a panoramic form. So it'll wrap a little bit around the audience. It'll fill your peripheral vision. And it's almost as though you're looking through the visor on a helmet. So you really have the sense that you're behind the wheel in these race cars in some of those shots. You see the audience there sitting in the seats. This photo was taken in mid-March, just as we were starting to shut down due to the virus, but you get a sense of what the theater will look like with the wall treatments. And capacity in their wing, I think, is about 30, 35 people.
Yeah, about the size of a school group.
And in our pursuit of authenticity, we wanted to make the seats really a part of the experience as well. And we've got a photograph of one here. And these are basically based on actual racing seats, right?
Yeah, they come from an aftermarket seat provider. So these are actually cars that you could put, or seats that you could put in your cars.
And there'll be speakers, I think, built behind some of them. So you really have a surround sound feeling as you're in there to make you feel as though you're part of the film. Absolutely an immersive experience.
Yeah, we really wanted to immerse people into, the emotion and the drive and the adrenaline of racing. And so, special attention was paid to providing each and every seat person in there, their own experience. So as you mentioned, each seat has a speaker, 2 speakers behind it, so that you get the sense of maybe your crew chief talking with you through your helmet communications. And then also the filming too, I think we didn't mention, but there's a lot of amazing drone work and, cameras put into different places in the vehicle. So that concept photo showed you as the perspective of the driver. And so there'll be a lot of footage like that, but also other, views that you wouldn't see otherwise.
And after we move out of the theater there, appropriately enough, our next zone is what we call showmanship. And from the very beginning, when we were first conceiving this exhibit several years ago, we wanted to emphasize performance in the exhibit, and really the 2 different meanings of performance. There's performance in terms of the driver's ability, the car's horsepower, top speed, that kind of thing, but there's also performance in the sense of entertainment. I mean, after all, race fans buy a ticket, they go into the grandstands, and they come to a race to be entertained. And you find that the best drivers have some of those qualities from both sides. They absolutely have skill on the track, but they also have a sense of showmanship or a sense of flair about them. And we wanted to profile two drivers from very different eras who have a surprising number of similarities. They were both kind of masters at the showmanship side of the business. And the one you see there at the top is Barney Oldfield, and we will be featuring him alongside Henry Ford's 1902 race car 999, which Barney Oldfield drove for a number of years and made very famous. And Oldfield really was the first multimedia racing star, America's first great racing hero. He's best remembered for these kind of wild exhibition races he would put on. He would race against airplanes and locomotives, or hire some local ringer to go up against him. Of course, inevitably he would win the race, but he was also a legitimate driver. I mean, he competed twice in the Indianapolis 500, finished in 5th place, very respectable both times. He also appeared in silent movies and in a stage play. So really the all-around product. And he did a number of product endorsements too, I should say. And we're going to compare and contrast him with one of today's biggest stars, Ken Block. And, if you've been anywhere online in the last few years, you've probably seen one of his amazing Gymkhana films. He's put together 10 of these films. They're each about 10 or 15 minutes long. He goes into these various areas, exotic locales, or sometimes industrial wastelands, and drives cars really all out. And one of the real special treats we acquired for this exhibit, one of our greatest new acquisitions really of any sort, is the car that Mr. Block drove in his Gymkhana 5, where he drives through San Francisco. That video came out in 2012, and in a way, it was really the video that I think broke Block big. A lot of folks saw that. It went viral very quickly, and all of his videos together have well over 100 million views. You get a sense of the reach he has, and he's a bit similar to Barney Oldfield. We've got this great example of our panel, which will be out there, and you're looking, by the way, at mock-ups of the cutaways. We're going to have life-size cutaways of both Oldfield and Block together, so you'll get to see them as they would appear in real life. But as you walk through there, you'll notice that they both were involved, of course, in film, and they were both involved in product endorsement. We talked about Barney Oldfield endorsing tires. Ken Block endorses tires. Barney Oldfield endorses soft drinks. Ken Block endorses energy drinks. So kind of fascinating to see the parallel between those two different drivers. And I think that's going to be really one of the most exciting parts of the exhibit, Wayne.
Yeah, I would agree.
Then we move from showmanship into our first sort of proper form of racing, if you will, which is land speed racing. And when you're talking about land speed in the U.S., the signature event, Speed Weeks in Bonneville, right? Late summer, early fall every year. Your signature track, in this case, is the Bonneville Salt Flats. And our profile people here will be Bob and Bill Summers, a pair of brothers from Southern California who built the Goldenrod, our fantastic land speed car. And of course, the two cars we'll feature are the Goldenrod, which you see there at the bottom. That's the car that set a record for a wheel-driven vehicle, not rocket-powered, not jet-powered, but wheel-driven with traditional piston engines, 409.277 miles an hour in 1965, a record that stood for many years. The other car we'll show is our Beatty belly tank Lakester there, which you see at the top, which designed by Tom Beatty, but based on a World War II airplane auxiliary fuel tank. There were, of course, many of these available as surplus after the war, and hot rodders realized that they were just the perfect streamlined shape, just big enough that you could cram some driver controls and an engine in those and then have yourself a great land speed car. So those will be fun. Here's an example of what one of our profile panels will look like, and in this case it is the Summers Brothers panels there. So there'll be photos, vintage photos of the person we're profiling. There'll be a paragraph again with sort of an explanation of what their contribution is to racing, why it is that they're significant. And then underneath we're doing a more traditional sort of stats box where you'll get things like, you know, when the driver was born, where they were born, when they passed away, if they have passed away, and then a number of career highlights. And here's a photo taken again in mid-March of the environmental setting we're creating for those two cars. So as you walk in, you're going to see this terrific panoramic photo taken out at the salt flats that will kind of wrap around you. And we're even building a replica of the salt surface for our floor here. So both of those cars will be sitting there, and you'll really be able to picture them as though they are at Bonneville. And this one really, I have to say, it knocked my socks off when I saw this being installed, just how well it turned out. So I'm excited. And the best part of all, because it's not real salt, it won't stick to the cars, it won't stick to the shoes, but I think it will create that feeling, and it really turned out well.
And this is going to be a stunning presentation. You know, the lighting isn't set up yet in this photo, but you know, it's going to be color tuned to look like daylight, and the salt is just gonna, reflect this massive amount of light in there and really give a sense for what the car is like out in that seemingly desolate landscape.
Absolutely. And just around the corner from our land speed section, we're going to have an activity for our youngest visitors that we're calling Gravity Racers. And it's basically a modified version of a wooden car derby or a pine wood derby that the Boy Scouts or the Cub Scouts get involved with these days. And we have little kits where people can build cars, kind of change out the wheels, change out the body shape. Not terribly complex, but enough for kids to experiment a little bit. And then we'll have lanes going across there, and you turn that wheel and drops the barrier, and the cars race down, and they will be timed by a speedometer here. We've got a photo, or a clock, I should say, will be timing them as they run down. Here's a look at the actual interactive being built out at the shop, so you'll see what it looked like, get a sense of the scale. But again, we're looking at our youngest visitors here, so we're not expecting them to learn a great deal necessarily about racing or the specifics of the technology in this, but we want them to realize basically that just by changing out the shape or the design of your car, it can affect how fast it goes down the hill. So really sort of the most basic lesson, but I think this will be a lot of fun for the kids, and we had a lot of fun putting this together.
I think it's the idea of just, some sort of free form play for the younger audience, and a bit of experimentation, and just getting at that really competitive nature that comes out in racing.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So moving from our hill fall, if you will, with the Gravity Racers, we go on to hill climb racing, which is really one of the earliest forms of racing in the United States. They used to be really all over, especially in the Midwest and the Northeast, but these days, when you talk about hill climb in the U.S., you're probably talking about the Pikes Peak International Hill Climb, certainly our signature event out there in Colorado. And in this case, the Pikes Peak Highway becomes our signature track. And the folks we're going to profile, the king of the mountain, Bobby Unser, who has won at Pikes Peak more than any other driver. And beyond Bobby, the larger Unser family, who certainly a dynasty of American racing. They've had success not only at Pikes Peak, but very notably at the Indianapolis 500 as well, where Al Unser, Bobby Unser, Al Unser Jr. have all won multiple times. And here's a look at our photo backdrop. We have in there a car on loan to us from Bobby Unser, and I should just let you take another look at that. Built in 1958. This is the car that Bobby won at Pikes Peak many times throughout the 1960s, with modifying it each year to remain competitive. We will have that car up on a platform in front of this background to look as though it's charging its way up Pikes Peak. And should note that photo is from one of the photos in our collection. Emily Kirk, our fantastic exhibit designer, graphic designer, did some wonderful work to touch it up, to colorize it, and to make it fit just right behind that car. So I think that'll be an exciting area here. And here's our first look at one of our sample event panels. So every time we feature a signature event in one of these different zones, there'll be a panel like this, which explains what makes this event unique, what makes it special. So for Pikes Peak here, we have a look at when the event takes place, the length of the track, the surface, and then a little paragraph with some history about the event. And there'll be a sidebar with each of these panels too, with some other additional information. In the case of Pikes Peak, it's the story of how they paved Pikes Peak not all that long ago, and how that sort of changed the nature of the race and made it perhaps a little less dangerous. But surprisingly, it wasn't paved because of safety concerns, but more environmental concerns because of runoff down the mountain on that dirt road. But in any event, that'll be nice. Picture of Bobby Unser there down in the lower right corner, and then the lower left corner, a more contemporary photo of modern Pikes Peak racing.
I want to mention too, Matt, that on those panels, each one has the sort of specifications or details about the track themselves, and you'll see that curvy line. We've actually raised that off the panel. So just like our touchable model cars, visitors who may not be able to see can come and feel the shape of that track, because all the tracks we're talking about are dramatically different in shape and sort of what they're doing. Some are straight lines, some are squiggly, some are oval. So this will give them a sense of what that's like.
And here's a look at our Perspectives in Racing Dynasty panel, where we talk about the Unser family dynasty here. And again, a pretty standard format there, a paragraph explaining the family's history and how they got started in racing and how they've dominated over the years. A nice photo of the first generation of Unser racers there, or the four brothers there with their father, and then a family tree, which helps you follow along through the Unser dynasty. And then down at the bottom, we have pictures of Bobby Unser, Al Unser, and Al Unser Jr. We have been fortunate over the years to actually interview each of those drivers. So you'll notice little red buttons on the bottom. We've selected quotes, kind of notable sound bites from each of those interviews. You can push a button and then actually hear Al Unser in his own voice tell this quote about what it is that racing means to him. And we'll reproduce the quotes as well in text. But I think that adds a real human touch to the exhibit, being able to hear these racers describe their experiences in their own voices.
And these audio panels are sprinkled throughout the whole experience, so you see them in various places along the way.
Then we move to the center, really the literal centerpiece of the exhibit here. Around the outside wall of the movie theater, we have what we call our winner's circle. And that's where we want to feature the real treasures in the Henry Ford's racing collection, the cars that are real game changers or groundbreakers. So as you walk through there, you're going to see things like the Miskowski there at top left. That's a car with which A.J. Foyt started his professional career, and it's equipped with the Offenhauser engine, which dominated in American racing for decades. The top right, you see our Mark IV, which won Le Mans in 1967 with Dan Gurney and A.J. Foyt again. And that was the first and to date, the only All-American victory at Le Mans. American drivers, American-built car, American team. So very special. And of course, the whole GT40 program is big right now because of the Ford versus Ferrari movie, which was such a big hit last year. Working our way down there on the lower left, you see our Chrysler 300B 1956 car, and one of the cars that was campaigned by Carl Kiekhaefer. And Kiekhaefer made his fortune with Mercury Marine outboard engines for boats. He got interested in stock car racing in the mid-1950s as a way to advertise his outboard motors. So he put together a team, and not just any team, but the very best. Kiekhaefer, for him, money was no object. So he made sure that his crews were all wearing neat matching uniforms. He hired only the best drivers, bought the best cars, had painted official transports. You know, these were the days when some drivers were driving the stock cars to the track in some cases. Not Kiekhaefer, he had them on professional trailers. He also had his pit crews rehearsing their stops to make them as great as they were. And sure enough, Kiekhaefer and his team absolutely dominated NASCAR in 1955 and 1956. So we'll talk about him and the professionalization of stock car racing. And then at the lower left, one of our most popular cars, the Lotus Ford, with which Jimmy Clark won the Indianapolis 500 in 1965, the very first rear-engine car to win the Indianapolis 500, and really changed the face of that race, gave it a more European flavor versus the heavier front-engine American roadsters that had won up to that point. And then in the middle, another Indy 500 car, this one on loan to us from our friends at General Motors. It's a wonderfully done replica of the car in which Rick Mears won the 1988 Indianapolis 500. And Mears won that year driving for Team Penske. So it'll give us a chance to talk about Roger Penske as one of the most influential team owners in all of racing. It continues to be today. Of course, Mr. Penske just recently purchased the Indianapolis 500 in the IndyCar series. So his story, one that the exhibit would not be complete without. So glad to be able to feature that. And here's a photo taken very recently. You see that we're going to have backdrop murals behind each of the cars. We're looking at A.J. Foyt here, a picture of him having won the Hoosier 100 in 1960 with that Miskowski car we looked at. So the car will be right there in front of it. And that will hold true for all the cars. They will all have a sort of a photo mural behind them related to that car's success. I think the next one we see there, just a corner of it, but that would be Jim Clark and Colin Chapman at Indianapolis in 1965. So of course that'll go behind the Lotus Ford, so on and so forth. But it's going to be a special area. And again, I think it will draw a lot of visitor interest as they walk through the exhibit. And here's a look at the folks we're going to profile, and they're all, of course, associated with those cars we looked at. So Harry Miller and Leo Goosen, both associated with the Offenhauser engine. And I should say now, I haven't shown a whole lot of artifacts in this slide presentation because we have to leave a few surprises for folks. But beyond the cars, we're going to have all kinds of smaller artifacts, helmets, suits, shoes, you name it, associated with racing. But one of the most special pieces we have, very recently acquired, is that tool set there. Those are drafting tools that belong to Leo Goosen, who for many years was Harry Miller's sort of right-hand man, his engineer. Miller would often come up with the ideas, and it was up to Goosen to make them work technically. So those tools are very special. Glad to have them there. Had to include them here. But the rest of our profile, certainly we'll be looking at A.J. Foyt, not only for his associations with the Mark IV and the Miskowski, but for his many successes at the Indianapolis 500, where he became the first driver to win that race 4 times. Going to look at Carroll Shelby, associated, of course, with the GT40 program and the Ford Mark IV. Dan Gurney, won with Foyt at Le Mans in '67, but one of America's greatest all-around drivers. Carl Kiekhaefer, who I already mentioned because of his influence on NASCAR and professionalizing stock car racing. And of course, Roger Penske, the captain, still one of the most dominant figures in American racing. And here's a sample of what the car panels will look like here. And we've gone with a little bit of a different format here than we have in other sections of the exhibit because the layout is a little different here. These will be larger panels that kind of work as sectional dividers between each car along that winner's circle. But the same sort of content. There'll be vintage fixtures, in this case of the Mark IV at Le Mans in '67, be a paragraph describing the car's significance, and then all the information down below, the technical information and specifications about the car, as well as that 3D printed model for visitors to touch and feel. I suppose we should note, Wing, our friends at Rolex have been our presenting sponsor in the Winner's Circle, so we are extremely grateful to them for their support in this exhibit and happy to have them involved.
That's right.
And here are two of the profile panels. So again, you get a sense of what those look like. Carroll Shelby there on the left-hand side. He was a successful driver until a heart condition kind of forced him to retire early, but he went on to make a greater impact as a designer, a builder, a manager, and really an all-around racing business professional. So we can talk about that side of the sport with him. And then Dan Gurney on the right, who we talk about as racing's Renaissance man. You know, he was the total package, successful in stock car, sports car, Indy car racing, Grand Prix Formula One racing. So certainly want to feature him there. From there, we move on across the aisleway to IndyCar racing. As I mentioned, arguably the most American form of racing, certainly one of the longest running. The Indianapolis 500, of course, our signature event. It's been running since 1911 and remains one of the oldest motor racing events that continues to be contested anywhere in the world. So certainly important. And you know, you talk to folks who don't necessarily follow motor racing. It's maybe the one race that they know of. I like to compare it to the Kentucky Derby. You know, folks who don't follow horse racing will probably tune in to watch the Kentucky Derby. Same with the Indianapolis 500. It's really an American tradition. Our signature track, of course, the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. And our profile person here will be Lynn St. James, a very important IndyCar racer, the first woman to win Rookie of the Year at the Indianapolis 500, which she did in 1992. And she competed in that race 7 times in the 1990s and into the very early 2000s. The 2 cars there, we're going to have a car that's not really a success story at the top, but that's one of the Miller Ford cars that Ford Motor Company sponsored in 1935, working with Harry Miller. And beautiful cars. Unfortunately, they were just rushed into production, so they had problems with overheating. In fact, the steering boxes would overheat on those cars, and the steering would lock up. Not a very good thing. So the 10 cars they sent down to Indianapolis, only 4 of them managed to qualify for the race, and none of them managed to finish. But that's a big part of racing, arguably a bigger part. You know, there are a lot more folks who don't win than there are actual winners, so got to talk about that. And beneath it, we have the car that Tom Sneva drove in 1984 at the Indianapolis 500. So it gives you a sense of how far cars have traveled in terms of their design and operation over the decades. And here's some conceptual art. You see the winner's circle, which we just talked about on the left, our Indianapolis area on the right. And we are, again, creating sort of environmental areas for these cars to be displayed. And you'll notice under the Miller Ford, we will have the brick that paved the track there at Indianapolis for many years, not entirely replaced until the 1960s. And even to this day, there's still a yard strip there at the start-finish line as an homage to the original brick surface of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. And then the Sneva car will have a more modern asphalt track surface underneath it, but with our own little version of that yard of bricks. And we've even tried to recreate the backgrounds appropriate from the time period. So we have a vintage photo of the 1930s behind the Miller Ford, a more contemporary photo behind the Tom Sneva car. You'll notice too, behind the Sneva car, we have a more modern catch fencing there, the kind they have at Indianapolis to protect spectators from flying debris. And here's a look at our event panel for this section, of course, the Indianapolis 500. So some information about the track, some history there. And with Indy, we wanted to focus on the traditions. Indy, I think, is known more than any other event in motor racing for its quirky traditions, whether it's Jim Neighbors singing Back Home Again in Indiana before the green flag, right down to the milk celebration there at the end of the race. And we see a photo there of Bobby Unser drinking milk. As I like to say, when the milk toast at Indy is anything but milk toast, if you'll pardon the pun. We also have one more car in the Indy section, which it really isn't much of a car anymore because it was involved in one of the most spectacular crashes in the history of the Indianapolis 500. And this was in 1973 with a driver by the name of Salt Walter. Here's a photo of Walter at Indianapolis with his car prior to the crash. And here's the car as it appears today in the Henry Ford's collection. We acquired this a number of years ago. This will be our first opportunity to put it out on display. But a terrible crash and a fire afterwards. Walter was injured severely in the crash, burned particularly over a great portion of his body, spent several months in the University of Michigan burn ward afterward, but he did survive and make effectively a full recovery from that. In fact, he returned to race in the Indianapolis 500 again in 1974. So we feel we can tell the story about that crash because he did make that recovery and come back to race again. And we can talk about how, a few years earlier, a crash of that severity could very well have killed a driver. So improvements in safety helped save Salt Walter's life. And of course, race cars have only gotten safer from that point on. So an important part of the story that we didn't want to overlook. And as we move from Indy, we move into what we call our Sports Car Performance Center. And you're looking at a top-down view here. We're going to have 3 cars featured inside this center and then an additional car outside. But this was our chance to really focus on the Henry Ford's Model I model for learning and innovation, which is a fairly recent development there. And you see here we talk about the traits that sort of separate innovators from other folks and the process they work through to come up with their innovations. And using Ford's recent return to the 24 Hour of Le Mans in 2016, we found we had a perfect model to apply our Model I language to. So we are going to talk about design, where any great idea starts, and we're going to look at the development of the new version of the Ford GT introduced in 2016. But when we talk about design, we have to talk about how it really evolves from the GT40s of the 1960s. So you'll see a screen there showing the different generations of the car leading up to the modern era there. We've also got another chart that Ford produced in the early 1970s, which kind of shows the evolution of the GT40 to that point, which they actually trace back to the Mustang 1 concept car, which some of you undoubtedly know we have in the collections of the Henry Ford. And for design, Ford Motor Company has loaned us a full-size clay model of the GT. And this, I think, is going to be really exciting. Probably some of our visitors don't realize that clay is still used in auto design. A lot of work done on computers now, of course, but there's really no substitute for having a 3-dimensional physical model of the car in life size. So this clay model will be a great example of that. From the design, our next Model I step is what we call optimize, where you take your original design and then try and improve it as best you can. And for optimize, our friends at Multimatic, who build the GT for Ford Motor Company, have built a very special car for us. It's, if I'm describing it right, it's sort of half street GT, half racing GT, kind of cut right down the middle. And the point here is not how different those two cars are, but how similar they are. One of the really unusual things about the modern GT stories is that the race car was really developed concurrently with the street car, side by side, rather than the street car just coming later as an afterthought or as a modification of the racing car. They really are very similar, and you will see that when you look at those two side by side. Here's a photo taken not too long ago up in Multimatic's shop just outside Toronto, and you see those two halves together. The spoiler on the left-hand side, and then on the right-hand side will be the competition version, the spoiler being the street version. Wing, I really do think this is going to be special, and Multimatic have been just great to work with throughout this whole process.
Yeah, they have been wonderful. It's been a pleasure. Certainly, I have learned a lot. And the car is going to be unlike anything anybody's ever seen, kind of a peek into the inner workings of it.
And finally, after you design your vehicle and optimize it, your next step, of course, is to implement it, to actually go in and try and achieve your goal, which in this case was for Ford to win the 2016 24 Hour of Le Mans, which in fact they did. They won their class with this car right here, the number 68 Ford GT, which is on loan to us from Ford Motor Company. And as you look at it, you'll notice it's still covered with dirt and debris. Ford was very careful after that victory. They wanted to preserve the car exactly as it looked when it came off of the racetrack in France that day. So we've kept all of that in place, and you'll see it in there. So you really will be able to follow the evolution of the car from the clay model to the half and half car right up to the winning car from 2016. Multimatic has also provided us with some of the data, and we wanted to talk about the pit box, the sort of race day nerve center where engineers and team members follow the race in real time and follow the car. So we're going to have a panel here describing the pit box and its purpose there and what kinds of data that engineers are tracing. We also wanted to talk a little bit about anticipating trouble, and the old motto there in racing: you have to expect the unexpected. It's amazing in racing how much it takes to win a race and how little it takes to lose a race, and that often happens due to factors outside your control. Anything from problems with someone else's car to bad weather. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And we're going to have a set of screens set up with actual telemetry data provided to us from Multimatic. These are our measurements and graphs that they followed during the 2016 Le Mans. They've given us that data so we can stream it on our own monitors, and you can get a sense that you're there at the race watching it with an engineer's perspective. And here's a screen cap of what those videos will look like. So as you look at the screens, you'll see the data streamed on the bottom. And again, exactly as the engineers saw it there at Le Mans. We'll have those blue panels every now and then to pop up and kind of explain what it is that you're looking at. And then at the top, we have footage captured at the race in 2016. On the left side, you're looking at an exterior view of Joey Hand's car. He was one of the drivers in the 68 car. And then an interior view of Joey Hand in the cockpit. So it will be fun to follow him around on a lap around the more than 8-mile Circuit de la Sarthe where Le Mans takes place.
I'm really excited about this area. I think that, one of the unique things that we're doing is we're certainly talking about the excitement of that one race and what the car achieved there, but we're spending more time actually talking about what it took to get there, and the multitude of people and hours and the 2 years worth of effort to get that car to win that race in 24 hours.
And this idea of sort of setting a goal and then working to achieve it and then meeting success is really one of our big takeaways from the exhibit. We realize, of course, not everybody who visits the exhibit is a racer or is going to go off and become a racing driver, but we all have those goals and those dreams in our lives, and if this can inspire folks to go in and work toward their own dreams, whatever they might be, then that's exactly what we want to happen.
Yeah.
And we've got to talk a little bit about sports car racing here with regard to the GT. And of course, the 24-hour Le Mans, not an American race, takes place in France, but nevertheless, we're looking at it from an American perspective. And American drivers and cars have competed at Le Mans from the very beginning, from the 1920s. But we're going to take a look here at the all-American sports car. You couldn't do a Racing in America exhibit without one. And that's the Corvette, of course. General Motors has loaned us the 2001 Corvette C5R. In fact, this is a car that won the 24-hour of Daytona, one of America's most famous sports car races, in 2001. So we'll have that on display, and this is a look at its panel. And you see we not only have photos of that Corvette, but we've got a photo of an earlier generation of Corvette there, racing at the 1959 LA Times Grand Prix. And this is also a chance for us to talk about the business side of racing. After all, racing exists to some extent to sell cars or to help manufacturers sell cars. So we can talk about that old adage, win on Sunday, sell on Monday. And we want to look at the ways manufacturers over the years have traded on their success on the racetrack. So you can start right with Henry Ford in the 1901 sweepstakes, which we talked about in our Dawn of Racing area, but also about how manufacturers have produced racing-inspired versions of their cars. So from 1972 there, we have a catalog page from Chevrolet and the Super Sport Camaro, which had a beefier suspension, a more powerful engine, but was really what we might call an appearance package. A lot of things that kind of looked racy, but weren't necessarily racing approved, if you will, modifications. And then we go right on down to the Dodge Viper ACR edition from 1999, which is, in fact, a race car. This is an actual factory-built race car you can go to your dealership and buy. So we'll take a look at that as well. And, not a coincidence, we wanted to represent all of the Detroit 3 there. So something from Ford, something from GM, and something from Chrysler. And right in this heart of this zone, kind of where sports car racing, Indy car racing, and stock car racing come together, we're going to talk about racing safety. And obviously, it's a very important topic in this exhibit, and an important thing to study the evolution of racing safety as well. And we have quotes from drivers and fans here and professionals that you'll see. You see Mario Andretti on the top. That's from an interview with him. And maybe his memorable quote there is where he talks about the danger aspect. And he says, when you're in a race, do you think about that danger? Not really, because if you do, you don't belong. So that's sort of that fatalistic sense almost that some of these drivers have, which helps them to do what they have to do every day. We interviewed a young racing fan, Chris Burke, not too long ago. He talks about him growing up in the 1990s and into the 2000s. Racing was always before and after Dale, a reference to Dale Earnhardt, who died at the Daytona 500 in 2001, and whose death really was a milestone in a movement toward greater racing safety. Some thoughts from Parnelli Jones about what it's like to see some of his colleagues and friends involved in racing accidents. And then we finished with some thoughts from Dr. Terry Trammell, who's been a longtime safety consultant at the Indianapolis 500 and really one of the experts anywhere in the world on racing safety. And his quote there's kind of fun. He says, when he first started in the early 1980s, the drivers were almost afraid to be seen with him, like it would be interpreted that they were weak. But that attitude has changed very much, and now drivers take safety very seriously, of course. And we're actually having a replica of a stock car cabin being built for us. So you'll be able to walk in there and see what one of these interior cages looks like. And this is just an early version of what the car would look like. It's come a long way since then, I think, Wayne.
Yeah, I actually saw it today, finished, and it looks great. You get this great peek inside the cockpit it's kind of, it's a safe car, so it's hard to see in there in the real thing. But, in this cutaway, you really get a nice look at all those safety features that are included in a contemporary stock car.
And in our stock car racing zone, our signature car will be the number 21 Ford Fusion, which has been on loan to us from the Wood Brothers in Virginia. And this is the car in which Trevor Bayne won the Daytona 500 in 2011. At that time, he had just turned 20, I think, the day before the race. So the youngest ever winner at Daytona. And again, a car that's been preserved just as it looked when it crossed the finish line. So it still has all that confetti on it. Our signature event, of course, the Daytona 500, the biggest event in all of stock car racing and in NASCAR. Signature track will be Daytona International Speedway. And we're going to profile Bill France Sr., really the father of modern NASCAR. Danica Patrick, one of the hottest stars of today, who retired only in the last few years from racing and not only had success in stock car racing, but also in IndyCar racing for that matter. And then the Wood Brothers, who are the most storied team in NASCAR. They've been active since the early 50s. They are still active in NASCAR today. And here's some more concept art to give you an idea of what it will look like in there with the Wood Brothers car off to the right. But this is an area that I think will be defined by our visitor interactives. We'll talk about those in a moment. Here's just a look at our Daytona panel so you get a sense of what it looks like. And I should mention, for these special races, a lot of them have special trophies associated with them. So we want to, of course, mention those where appropriate. So here it's the Harley Earl Trophy, which is what drivers compete for at the Daytona 500. Indianapolis famously has the Borg Warner Trophy. NHRA at the Winter Nationals, they compete for Wally's, named after Wally Parks, the founder of the NHRA. So I want to take a look at those as well. But I mentioned the visitor interactives, and here in stock car racing, we wanted to really focus not just on the drivers, but on the crews, the pit crews in particular. So we are going to have 2 half cars being built for us, and you see them there under production in these photos, that will be set up for pit crew activity, and teams can go in there, they can operate the jack, raise the car, they can change out the tire, they can fill it up with gas, and they can do it all against the clock or against each other. So there'll be a real sort of sense of competition involved in this, and this has been a lot of fun to put together. I think, Wayne, it's going to be great for our visitors.
Yeah, it will be. One of the things I really like about it is, we were able to acquire actual 2020 body panels from with GM's help and actual liveries for cars. So those are today vehicles, plus all of the tools, the tires, the torque wrenches, the fuel cans are all real to the sport. And so those are the same things that you'll get to use in this activity.
We will have an orientation video before you start that activity, kind of telling you a little bit about the importance of a pit crew and the work involved in that, and the speed, which is essential to the work. And that's going to be presented by Brianna Daniels, who of course is also featured in our main film, Fueled by Passion. But her story is so inspirational, so great, we wanted to feature her again talking about it. And she's got some great observations on her time in NASCAR and the sort of excitement she feels being a part of a pit crew. So this is just a screen cap from that video she was kind enough to do for us. And here's a sort of a wider pullback view. Again, you see our pit crew activity there on the top left. And then on the right, you see something else that's going to be, I think, very popular in the exhibit, our simulators. We've put together a series of racing simulators, very much like what the real drivers use, that will allow our visitors to get in there behind the wheel and experience what it's like on a track. And here's a photo of two of the prototype units, I guess, that we've been testing at the museum for several months now. But the nice thing about these wings is that they'll be flexible. We can change them out rather quickly. So if we want to have Indianapolis in there one week, we can do that. If we want to do the Daytona 500 the next week, we can do that. And you know, you can come back several times in a year and not have the same experience twice.
Yeah, and actually we have 6 of them, so that group will get to race against one another. So if you were there with your family or your friend, you have that opportunity, you know, to see who get the best lap time and maybe bump them a little bit here and there, and it'll be a lot of fun.
And we should probably mention this will be an extra charge attraction, which even a lot of museums have experimented with those. We've experimented with those from time to time at the Henry Ford. So I think that'll be good, not only for the financial consideration, but frankly to control the crowds, because otherwise these are going to be very popular activities.
Yeah.
Then you move around from the driving simulation to what we call our motorsports performance training area. And from the beginning, we wanted to stress in this exhibit that race car drivers are athletes. It's this sort of bad notion that goes around among a lot of folks that, if you're driving a car, you're just sitting there in the seat, you're not really an athlete in the way that, say, a basketball player is or a football player. And nothing could be further from the truth. Racing drivers are as athletic as any other participant in any other sport you'll see. And we're going to talk about that in this area and give visitors a chance to try the same physical and mental training that racing drivers try. And we're looking at what the area will appear like when you get into this zone in the back corner of the exhibit. Here's a photo of the facility down in Indianapolis that is operated by a group called Pit Fit Training, run by a fellow named Jim Leo, who really was the first person in the United States to produce a physical training program specifically designed for race car drivers. And we have to give Lynn St. James credit. We've been working with her over the years on this exhibit, and she put us in touch with Jim. We went down to Indianapolis about a year and a half ago, and got to spend a day down there trying some of these activities, and got a lot of great ideas for how to bring those ideas into Driven to Win. And we're using some of the same equipment that PitFit uses that visitors will be able to go in and try. And not only physical activities, but mental activities. We've been working with an outfit called Synaptic, who produces what I'll call mind-memory challenge games, reflex building activities here. And we're going to have a screen set up, and it will be flashing different shapes, different colors, different locations. And your challenge will be to match those shapes, to touch them as quickly as you possibly can. And generally, Wing, I think we don't like our visitors to leave an exhibit frustrated, but in this case, maybe we do. It's going to be a little frustrating to realize how difficult this is and what the drivers are having to do.
Yeah, that really is part of the point, isn't it? Synaptech and PitFit have been really great partners with us along this way, and they've been very supportive of what we're trying to do. And the two of them, they're actually working together on getting real driver data for the Synaptic station that we're going to feature in the exhibit. And meanwhile, they're actually testing out new ideas with one another that I think sort of was spurred by what we're trying to do in the exhibition here. So that's pretty exciting.
I think this is going to inspire a lot of friendly competition among friends and siblings who visit the exhibit, and even individual visitors. I think they're going to want to return to this again and again to try and best their scores.
You and I certainly.
Yeah, that's right. And here's a look at one of the physical training activities that we're reproducing, again, taken right from the PitFit playbook. On the left, you see the actual steering wheel activity that takes place at PitFit. And then on the right, you're seeing our version of it, which is designed just to be a little simpler, a little more durable, frankly, to hold up to repeated use from our visitors. But there's a series of 5 different flashing lights you see arranged in an arc, and there's that target in front of them. The target is connected right to the steering wheel, which itself is weighted with some heavy weights to kind of simulate the forces you'd be dealing with driving in a race. And the idea is that those lights will flash in a random sequence, and you'll have to steer that target to whatever light lights up, and then you'll be timed and scored based on your accuracy in steering that wheel. And again, that's going to be interesting, just how tiring it is even in a short period of time. And then you can imagine doing that for 2.5, 3 hours straight in an automobile race. Then after that, we move into drag racing, which is another peculiarly American form of racing. You know, it's starting to catch on in other parts of the world, but you know, not as big in Europe, for example, as it is in the United States. And got two cars we're going to feature. We have our Buck and Thompson Slingshot Dragster, a kit car built by a couple of young fellas in the Rockford, Illinois area in the early 1960s with a Ford V8 engine. And called a slingshot, incidentally, because the driver actually sits behind the rear axle there, like if you can imagine a rock in a slingshot. So there you go. And then down below that, the world's wildest Willis, the car built by Ohio George Montgomery, who really was the first driver to actually make a living just drag racing. You know, a lot of these drivers in the late 50s, early 60s, they had day jobs and then they would go out and drag race on the weekends. But Ohio George was so successful and frankly such a kind of a colorful figure that he was able to travel the country and make a living just doing his drag racing with his Willis there. Our signature event in this case will be Winter Nationals, the big competition held out in February at Pomona. Our signature track, the Auto Club Raceway at Pomona in California. And our profile people, in this case, will be the Force family. And we already talked a little bit about the Forces and Brittany Force in particular being in our video, but we're going to talk about her and her sisters and John Force in this section. They have dominated drag racing for generations now, we can say. Here's some concept art, and we're doing kind of a tribute to the Detroit Dragway, which some of you may remember was a popular venue here in Detroit, just a little south of the city there along I-75. So we have the sign there in the middle. We have our Christmas tree up front, and that is going to be interactive as well. And that's kind of fun to let visitors see how quickly they can react to the Christmas tree. And if you know how those things work, you know, you're not only punished for reacting too late, you can also be punished for reacting too early. So it really is a trick to get that just right. And then here's our drag racing section panel. So every section or every zone of the exhibit you move through will have a main panel that kind of explains this form of racing, what it is that makes it unique. And I mentioned the trophies. You see a photo of the Wally there on the left, which is the big trophy in NHRA. A great kind of evocative period photo there at the bottom. Those were the pre-Christmas tree days when there would be a flagman out on the strip who would literally jump in the air and wave flags to get the racers started. And you know, that became a lot of the excitement. We also want to talk about diversity in racing and in drag racing in particular. Drag racing, because of its roots in street racing and because of its fairly low financial threshold for getting involved in it, has always attracted a number of different drivers and owners and mechanics, technicians from different backgrounds. So we want to celebrate that in particular as we talk about drag racing. And then somewhere in the exhibit, of course, we had to have some space for announcers, right? The folks who are up there in the press box calling out the race, whether it's for the fans right there in the stands or the folks listening on radio or maybe watching on television. And we're going to look at three of the best here with Sid Collins, who was the longtime voice of the Indianapolis 500, Barney Hall, longtime NASCAR announcer, and then Dave McClelland, who was the voice of the NHRA for many, many years. We've got a choice quote from each of them, and these are not quotes from calling races. These are their own personal reflections on what it means to be an announcer, what it takes to do that job. So I think that's important. But that said, these will also be push-button audio features here. You can push a button and hear a sample of their calling of a race. So you get a sense of their style. And we're going to have a couple of videos there too on monitors that will hang up above the drag racing cars there. And one of them here, we're looking at a screen cap from one that looks at the sort of drag racing greats, the great drivers. So we're going to talk about folks like Don Prudhomme, the Snake, and Tom McEwen, his buddy, the Mongoose, who very popular in the 1970s. We'll certainly look at Big Daddy Don Garlitz, Shirley Muldowney, Connie Kalidas, so people like that who are still revered in drag racing circles. And then we also we'll have another video that takes a look at the great races over recent decades. And the nice thing about drag racing is that it's over so quickly, we can actually not just show clips, we can show complete races in there. So that should be fun. And hats off to our friends at the NHRA Museum in California. They've been great to work with too and have provided us all of these resources and been happy to help us along the way. We also have here kind of a secondary entrance into the exhibit. So your main entrance will be off the car court. The secondary entrance will be off what we'll call the left side of the exhibit toward Heroes of the Sky, for those of you who are familiar with the museum and its floor plan. And we're kind of being a little clever here in our secondary entrance in that we're going to talk about not only an entrance in the exhibit, but the entrance into racing, how folks get interested in racing. And it might be because of those factory-built race cars. And GM is loaning us a Chevy Camaro ZL11LE, which is their version of a factory-built race car. I mean, you can buy one of these and take it out on the track, and you're good to go. They're actually loaning us one that set an all-time Camaro record on the Nürburgring in Germany. So that's exciting. It's not just any Camaro, but one with a special history. So we'll look at that. We're also going to look a little bit at pop culture here too, and racing movies and things like that to get people interested in sports. So again, it's an entrance into the exhibit, but also talking about an entrance into racing itself, how people get interested and involved in the sport. Now we should mention we've reserved the car court, which for those of you who've been in the museum over the years, it's where the Mark IV is on display right now and has been for the last couple of years, but that central area by the driving theater. We wanted to reserve that for cars we can change in and out a little more frequently than in other areas of the exhibit. And we're going to start with a couple of cars, again, on loan to us from GM. These are both land speed cars that raced out of Bonneville in the early 2000s to promote the Ecotec line of engines that GM was developing at that time. So we're going to have a car that's really an homage to the belly tank Lakester, like our baby belly tank Lakester that you'll look at, and you see the panel for that on the left. Then on the right, we have the Cobalt SS, the Cobalt compact car that GM was promoting at that time and sent out to Bonneville as a way to get some headlines for that vehicle. So we'll have those two there, but I anticipate we'll be bringing in many, many new cars into the car court over the years as the exhibit goes on. And then we'll finish out here with a special piece of artwork we've commissioned just for this exhibit. And this is sort of our story of racing, if you will. Sort of an evolution of racing, but more a chart explaining where each car in the exhibit fits in the grander scheme of auto racing. So as you look at the chart there on the top, we have what we call our pioneers of racing. So the two Henry Ford cars, the Sweepstakes, the 999, and then the Locomobile Old 16. Those are all veterans and really rare early American racing cars. And then as you move down that, you'll see we're looking at different types of racing, whether it's IndyCar, land speed, sports car, stock car, drag, hill climb, drift, and then a couple of production race cars. And underneath that, we have the cars in the exhibit. So you get a sense of where they fit. And there'll be some basic specs on them. We've got wheelbase in there and that kind of thing. Horsepower, I think, as well. And then beyond that, you can look at, we have that little diagonal line running on the right-hand side of the poster. Under that, we wanted to include what we call the wider world of racing. So these are cars that aren't necessarily represented in the exhibit at this point, but are still important and influential in racing. So got a top fuel dragster there. We've got an off-road vehicle, Big Ole, Parnelli Jones's truck that he drove in the Baja for many years. Got a classic 32 Ford hot rod. We even had some fun there with a demolition derby car. I think that's an Oldsmobile Tornado. And I remember growing up as a kid, those cars dominated demolition derbies because they were big and they were front wheel drive, which was advantageous. We even have a 24-hour Le Mans car there, which is fun, and the station wagon there. And should be cool. And then at the bottom, you'll notice some great graphs. We bring back the idea of the racing circuits, so you get a sense of what they look like, how they're shaped, and they're not all necessarily in scale to one another given the size disparities and their distance, but nevertheless, we have the information there for how long those tracks are, and you can see how they compare to one another. And then there's an interesting bar graph that actually starts on the right, and the bars move to the left with the alternating gray and yellow lines, and those represent the distance that is covered in a typical race, and those are kind of fun because in our case, they range from a drag race, which is a quarter mile, all the way up to the 24-hour Le Mans, which can be more than 3,000 miles by the time a car is finished racing around that track for 24 straight hours. So fun to see those differences as well. Of course, 500 miles is the classic with the Indy 500 and the Daytona 500. But really excited. We're going to have a full-size version of this poster outside our movie theater for folks to look at and admire. And Wing, I think we've also arranged to have some reproductions made for sale in the museum store as well.
Yep, it'll be available in the gift shop.
So that's it's an exciting event, and we're looking forward to getting Driven to Win open. And say it's been a long time coming, but we've had a lot of fun putting it together. And, frankly, Wing, I think the shutdown year too has given us a chance to look at some new things, reevaluate them, make a few changes, just to make the exhibit as best as we possibly can.
Yeah, well, given that racing is an ever-changing sport, and a lot has happened in the last couple months, we've been able to make a couple updates here, and I think everybody's going to be really excited by the experience.
Looking forward to getting it finished and opening up as soon as we can. So we'll look forward
Yep.
to seeing you all there.